Yeah, we didn't get any 360 footage.
Oh. So how many trackers are you flying?
Actually, we got 3 technically.
Yeah, with LoRa, it's 3.
Get out there, yeah.
I am your mouthpiece.
Okay. This is Andrew. He is our amateur radio enthusiast. He's going to tell you a little bit about the payload and how we do everything to track our balloon.
Hi, good morning. So as Trevor mentioned, talk a little bit about amateur radio. So the payload itself contains 2 trackers, as they're called. They are low power transmitters that send out telemetry data from the payload throughout its flight. So about every 30 seconds to a minute, depending on how we configure the code. The trackers themselves are Arduino. And we have customized the code base a little bit, but we set the interval for the transmit. It will take the current location of the payload and its altitude and speed and course heading and transmit that over APRS, as it's called, which is the Automatic Position Reporting System. It is basically packet radio set of services on the amateur radio bands, on the 2-meter band specifically. And there are repeaters across the United States that will that are hooked up to the internet. They'll receive that beacon, kind of like an SMS text message, and then deliver it to the internet. So we are able to track the payload through like an APRS website or some other sites as well that aggregate that data, and you can actually check the position of the payload in near real time. If you look at the payload, you will see that we got this kind of wooden structure of dowels that are around it. So this creates the support structure for our antennas. We have 2 antennas, so since we're flying 2 trackers, so we have a standard dipole antenna, and then we have this, it's a double quad, but it's basically a higher gain loop. So the trackers themselves send out about 1 watt of power on transmit, which is plenty enough for us to hear it pretty far away when it's up during its flight. But we essentially designed this and did some modeling around it because we wanted to get a higher radiated amount of power from the tracker. So with this antenna, it should be around 3 to 5 watts depending on the match. And that becomes important. So we track it throughout its flight, and then when it lands on the ground, typically the last time we hear an update from it is maybe around 3,000 feet. And by the law of statistics, we land in a cornfield, and we won't know exactly its exact position. So with this high gain antenna, as we go to on site where it was last heard from, we should hear another update from it directly within a couple miles from it, and then we can actually triangulate and retrieve the payload. The payload itself has cameras, a battery pack, a big LiPo pack for running the cameras. We have the data logger in it, the 2 trackers, and then we're also flying this new LoRa payload. So LoRa is an alternative way, a different set of services. Instead of the 2-meter band for amateur radio, actually runs at 915 megahertz, which is a set of spectrum allocated for a non-licensed set of services where you can relay telemetry, which is what she's working on, which is really cool. We're going to be flying a 3rd tracker and a new experiment. So any questions? I went through a lot of maybe a little bit of jargon, so about the payload or how we track it, or anything else about it I can answer real quick and keep going with my spiel.
Gee, Andrew, where's the stuff that we did in class? Is that inside the payload?
There is a data logger inside the payload.
At the very
very bottom. With the GPS antenna. External GPS antenna right here.
This is super exciting stuff. Do you have to be licensed to be able to run all this amateur
I'm glad
radio?
you asked. So, if you have maybe a grandfather or an uncle who's an amateur radio operator, it is a licensed set of services. It's called the Amateur Radio Service because there's a lot of volunteer activities like storm spotting that the amateur radio community does. And there are a couple of exams that you can take. The first entry-level exam is called the technician's license. And a lot of the concepts the exam itself covers are just like you would, if you're a brand new driver and you're doing driver's ed and you need to learn the rules of the road and how to operate a motor vehicle safely. It's the exact same kind of concept for amateur radio. There's a little bit of technical knowledge, The exam itself focuses on the FCC rules of Part 97 in terms of power limits and things like that, and then what frequencies you're allowed to use. And there's an actual band plan that tells you, for this class license, these are the privileges that you get. So the technician class license includes 2 meters and 2 meters at 144 megahertz or VHF frequencies. There's other parts of the amateur radio bands that you have access privileges to, including UHF and a little bit of privileges in the HF bands. The HF bands on amateur radios have, if you have like a general class or an extra class license, you can actually talk on voice to people all over the world on HF. Any questions about that? It's really cool. We just did
we're just wrapping up, so probably about another 3 to 5 minutes.
So it's cool. We just did a launch for a Boy Scout group this past weekend, and one of the scouts actually got his technician class license, and we actually flew his call sign on the payload. So the trackers themselves, as I mentioned, are Arduino based. So we actually, when we update the sketch and reflash the trackers, we're actually putting our amateur radio call sign on it that it transmits. That was really cool for him that we were able to do that. Any other questions about the payload? I can talk more about APRS, but
We will make sure we share the link to the class. APRS.fi. It's a website where you can actually track the real-time positioning of that balloon. The same thing whenever we actually go to recovery. Myself, Andrew, maybe Tom, and a couple others will actually get in our vehicle and drive south of Champaign to be able to recover. Josh Remark here is actually running an iGate in his vehicle, so that's how we can actually see some of those additional transmissions from the ground. That iGate was instrumental in recovering the we launched last, because like Andrew said, we lose connectivity with it at about 3,000 feet, so then it is kind of a guess. To be able to track it as it gets further. That is awesome. Andrew, did you talk about the Fox on it?
we did not. Or I did not. Like I mentioned, the trackers themselves are Arduino based, so we have added some additional features to it. So the trackers by default are just designed to transmit at a regular interval. Gets a GPS lock, pulls its coordinates, and then transmits that information in a standard APRS packet. We had actually added some Fox Hunt functionality where in the code base, once it's completed its flight and it's goes below a certain altitude, say we set it like 1,500 feet, and it's on the ground, it's not moving, then it changes frequency and transmits more often. So if for some reason we couldn't locate it, we could point a directional antenna at it and find it that way. Yep. Yeah, I was gonna say we got to get our flight line straightened out here.